The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Even when the Canada-US border was closed during this pandemic, truck drivers moved billions in goods between the two countries. Tonight, we'll find out why truckers say disruption may be inevitable going forward. Then, this Lincoln Alexander Day, we'll look back at his life and legacy. Also, our Ontario hubs update us on the COVID-19 emergency in Bearskin Lake First Nation. It's Friday, January 21st, and that's ahead on the agenda. Last November, Canada and the U.S. announced that beginning this month, truck drivers crossing the border must be fully vaccinated or test and quarantine. But according to some industry voices, that could lead to major problems. With us now for that perspective, in Clinton, Ontario, Mike Millian, president of the Private Motor Truck Council of Canada. Hello, Mr. Millian.
Good evening. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much for being on the show. What are the current rules for unvaccinated Canadian truck drivers, and as of midnight tonight, for U.S. drivers as well?
Okay, so there's two rules. The first one is coming into Canada. It's been in effect since last Saturday, January 15th. So any unvaccinated Canadian driver returning to Canada has to arrive with a PCR test within 72 hours, is allowed to deliver their load, and then they will have to quarantine for 14 days. An unvaccinated American driver will be turned around at the border and sent back. Effective midnight tonight, any non-American who is entering the U.S. by land who is unvaccinated will be turned around and sent back and will not be allowed entry into their country.
What do these new rules mean for your industry?
It's going to have a severe effect on our supply chain. There's 120,000 Canadian truck drivers who cross the U.S. border on a regular basis. There's 40,000 U.S. drivers who cross back and forth between the border on a regular basis. These drivers move roughly, there's $700 billion of trade that crosses our border every year, and roughly 70% of this is moved by trucks. According to a study that we just completed, that 70 trucking companies replied to, which accounted for 13,600 drivers. 25% of the drivers are unvaccinated on that survey that we did. So if we look at a 20% on the unvaccinated rate, giving room for error, we're looking at removing a fifth of that workforce, and that's just Canadian drivers. On the U.S. side, we're looking at roughly a 40% unvaccinated rate. So we're looking at even removing more drivers. So if you remove a fifth to a quarter of the workforce that brings our groceries over, our produce, our fruits, our vegetables, our meats, our fuel, all our essential goods, you remove that capacity, it's going to cause serious problems.
We're going to go over those numbers that you mentioned in just a moment. A lot of people have said that, I guess one of the defenses that the government is using is that your industry has known about this for a while, that these changes were coming. So do you feel taken aback, or do you feel like you need more time?
Yeah, that statement by the government is a little concerning to us. The industry hasn't known about these rules for a long period of time. That the Canadian government announced on November 19th that if people wanted to cross the border, they were going to have to be fully vaccinated by January 15th. That is a period of roughly 8 weeks. So if you have any drivers who were hesitant to get the vaccine for one reason or another, and then decided they were going to get vaccinated to keep their job, you have not provided them enough time for when you made that announcement. If we look at the timelines, it takes you roughly 6 weeks, if everything works perfect, for you to become fully vaccinated. You have to make your appointment for your first shot. Then it's a 4-week delay before you can get your second shot. And then you have to wait 14 days after that before you're considered fully vaccinated. So that's a minimum of 6 weeks. And these drivers are on the road in a lot of cases, so they're gone a week or two at a time. And I think we all know there's been periods of times in here, especially in December, when some people were booking appointments and they were booking them 2 months out. So to say that 8 weeks notice was a sufficient amount of time to allow drivers to become fully vaccinated that had changed their mind to become fully vaccinated, that's simply not true. We have been asking for a delay for at least 3 months for quite some time, and just it fell on deaf ears, and unfortunately we didn't receive one.
How would you describe the morale in your industry right now?
It's tough. There's a lot of people that are affected by this. Like I said, you have a lot of people that are going to be out of jobs, and you're looking at the trucking industry as a whole, who since March of 2020 has been considered essential workers and have been moving goods back and forth across the border. We went from March of 2020, where I think everybody in the industry found out what it is that drivers do, and the drivers felt they were getting the respect that they hadn't been given for quite some period of time. So they were thought of as heroes. When we were all asked to stay home, quarantine in place, reduce contacts, long before vaccines were around, truck drivers were asked to continue to do their job, and did continue to do their job to make sure we could get medical supplies, oxygen, blood, food, fuel, excuse me, all the other items that we need. Drivers have been doing this for 22 months. When our borders were closed in March of 2020 to everybody except essential travelers, truck drivers continued to go back and forth across the border. So the fact that they feel they sacrificed, and now they're being told you're out of work unless you get this vaccine, when they were doing the job before vaccines were around, it's some of them are pretty upset about it.
Do you think that the public is a bit to blame in this conversation? Because as you mentioned, you were considered to be heroes at one point during this pandemic. And for us, when we go to our grocery stores, and if something is missing, maybe that's when we realize that something is going on, but we're not able to connect the dots. Do you think a part of this has to do with the public, the general public, just kind of taking for granted what you all do?
I never want to blame the public. I think we all take things for granted that is just always there for us. I think that's human nature. Before the pandemic hit, we used to joke in the industry, trucking part of it as well as the entire supply chain. We all did our jobs too well. Everybody in the supply chain did their jobs so well that shelves were always stocked and everything you needed was there. And when everything you need is always there, it is going to be taken for granted because you don't have to worry about it. When COVID hit, the supply chain started to fracture, not just from the trucking end, but the entire supply chain, rail, marine, air, trying to get the components made and into the boats and shipped across. The whole entire supply chain started to fracture. And then when people realized the role that truck drivers take in it, they are the first and last mile of every delivery. Doesn't matter if it comes by a train or a boat or a plane, the truck has to get it from that facility inland or get it from inland to that facility. So you are the first and last mile. So I don't think I'd blame the public. It's just industry has always stepped forward and done its job. And when you do that, people do tend to take it for granted.
We talked a little bit about the supply chain. With these new rules, how will the unvaccinated trucker situation affect our supply chains?
Well, as I mentioned before, when you remove up to a quarter of the workforce, so a quarter to a fifth, we're talking 160,000 drivers. We're looking at removing anywhere between 30 to 40,000 of that from the workforce. If you do that, you cannot help but have dire consequences on your supply chain. So what we're going to see within a week or two, in my opinion, we are going to see two things that this is going to affect. We're going to see shortages at our grocery stores and other places where we get our essential supplies and needs. And we're going to see more inflation. And we know how bad inflation already is. A report came out the other day, inflation's at 4.8%. It's the highest it's been since 1991. When you shrink the capacity the way we're shrinking it and remove this many drivers from the capacity, those that are bidding to get trucks to pick up their freight are going to have less capacity to reach out to. So if you're lucky enough to get a truck to move your freight, you're going to have to pay more to get that truck to bring it across. It's simple supply and demand economics. So as shipping costs go up, the shippers can't afford to absorb that. They are going to have to pass that along to the consumer, and we're also going to see more increase in prices at our fuel pumps and our grocery stores and anywhere else where we get our items.
About 2/3 of the goods moved between Canada and the U.S. are shipped by truck. And the survey that you mentioned earlier, I wanted to go through some of the numbers. This survey was conducted by your organization, Private Motor Truck Council of Canada. It ran for 2 days between January 17th and 19th. It's not a scientific sample, but it can give us an idea of where your members are at. According to the survey, here at home, there are about 120,000 truck drivers in Canada. Approximately 75% of Canadian drivers are vaccinated. Around 30,084 of Canadian drivers are not vaccinated. As for the situation south of the border, there are about 40,000 cross-border American drivers. Approximately 55% of American drivers are vaccinated, and around 18,000 of these American drivers are not vaccinated. I think there are people who are watching this and listening to this, and they're wondering, why not just get vaccinated?
Well, and let me be clear, our association, our membership, we are in favor of vaccines. We believe when the scientists tell us it's what we need to do to get out of this. I'll be honest, I'm fully vaccinated. My family's fully vaccinated. So it's not that we're against vaccines. What we are against is mandates that are putting people out of work in an industry where the very nature of the job of a truck driver is working in isolation. A truck driver spends the majority of the day in a cab of a truck by themselves. They don't interact with other people on a regular basis. When they pick up and deliver at the shipper and receiver's premises, the industry, the supply chain has put protocols in place back when the pandemic first hit to reduce contacts. Most of the paperwork is exchanged electronically or hand through a slot in the door. We've had enhanced cleaning measures in the vehicles themselves. So all these measures have reduced the risk of spread from the trucking industry, and we've had no major outbreaks associated with the industry. So I understand where people might say, get vaccinated, and hey, would we love to see more people vaccinated? Sure we would. But the fact is, no matter how hard any of us push, 100% compliance is never going to happen. And we have an industry that we already had an 8% 8% of jobs not filled. 23,000 vacancies existed at the end of the third quarter. So we've already got a shortage, and we already have supply chain issues. And removing people from these supply chain jobs, we just don't feel is the best way to do it. So we certainly encourage people to get vaccinated. We just don't believe making this decision in a silo is in the best interest of our society, to be honest with you. We know the decisions are made to try and increase public health and protect our health and safety. We know that's why the government's doing this, and we appreciate that. But my fear is we look at stuff in a silo too much. So we're worried about looking at the effects on public health and safety on this side. But how seriously are we looking at the fact that if we remove 20 to 25% of the workforce and we have shortages of our essential needs, how much is that going to affect the public's health and safety? So a decision on one side has repercussions on the other side. And I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid we're going to see serious repercussions on the other side.
You mentioned that truck drivers tend to spend a lot of time by themselves. Have there been COVID outbreaks within the trucking industry that you know of?
Well, the trucking industry is part of the general public. So, I mean, sure, we've had some outbreaks, but none of them that we have found have been contributed to their jobs. There was an outbreak back, let's say, in the fall in the Peel region, but most of that was involved in community spread. So a lot of it is occurring when the drivers are perhaps outside their workplace. They still have lives like the rest of us do. And I think when they're on the job and they're working, like a lot of us, they're more hyper protective, and sometimes the guard gets let down a little bit when you're at home. So I'm not going to say that there's been zero cases attributed to the trucking industry, because that would be a lie. But there hasn't been any large outbreaks attributed to the work that the drivers are doing when it comes to their job.
Well, looking forward, because the situation as it stands, you are concerned that there are going to be unintended consequences. What is the solution then to the lack of drivers if encouraging vaccines isn't getting the response you'd like?
Well, I mean, ultimately, and both countries have made their decisions now, but ultimately, we're hopeful that we could see decisions made to push this back if we see serious repercussions on the supply chain. Long term, as an industry, we need to get more people interested in this profession. And so long term, we need to get reach out to our youth, reach out to schools, get involved, and make this job top of mind to people when they're younger, make it top of mind to parents when they're younger. We have a truck driving shortage. We also have mechanic shortages. We also have IT jobs within the industry, safety and risk specialists. There's all sorts of opportunities within this industry that we have shortages for. And people, we need to do a better job of making them aware of all the opportunities within the industry. You want to be a driver, you can get into it relatively quickly and make a good living right off the bat. And if you want to stay as a driver, you're more than welcome to do that. Or there's opportunities to move up through it. So long term, we need to do a better job of getting people interested in our industry. And, I think we seriously need to look at pay structures down the road too. We need to transition more into a pay by the hour industry as opposed to pay by mile, where drivers may be getting punished if they're stuck in a traffic jam or other things and they can't help it. Like, there's a whole bunch of things we need to look at. But I've been in this industry for 32 years now. Had to do some math in my head. Started out as a driver and moved up through. I believe in this industry. It's a good opportunity. I believe there's lots of challenges or lots of opportunities within it. But as an industry, we need to do a better job of getting that out there.
Canadians have been sharing different images online of the rising costs in the grocery store, empty shelves. You mentioned inflation at a 30-year record high. Your industry, of course, helps stock those shelves. When do you see the effects of this mandate appearing on not having enough goods on the shelves? When do you see the impact of this mandate?
Yeah, in some instances, I think we're going to see it very short. We're almost a week into the Canadian mandate now, and I think we're going to start to see it in the next week or so, especially when it comes to items like produce, fresh fruits, and vegetables. This time of year, the majority of our fresh fruits and vegetables are coming from south of the border, and the majority of them are being transported by truck. So I believe in areas like that, there's a lot of meat moved across the border. In areas like that, I think we're going to see it very, very quickly. I have seen posts online already from people showing empty shelves at their grocery stores in the produce and meat sections. I don't believe that's because of the border mandate yet. I could be wrong. But I saw these posts within 2-3 days, and I don't think it would affect quite that quickly. I think we had people panic buying, which led to increased traffic and pulling these products down. And then we had some severe winter weather on the East Coast on the weekend, as well as in Ontario and Quebec, that likely attributed to some of these challenges. But I think we're going to see it very quickly when it comes to produce and meat. And so we affected with this is going to be decreased supply and options and increased pricing.
We've been hearing of a trucking convoy making its way to Ottawa in protest of these new rules. Can you tell us anything about that?
I don't know much about it other than what everybody else has seen. We're not involved with organizing it. This is, for the most part, a driver-led organization and protest. Our messaging is we believe in people's rights to peacefully protest. That's what makes this country such a great place to live. What we do encourage is people that are involved in this protest and trying to get their voices heard and help get the message out there. Be respectful, be polite, get the messaging out appropriately, and do not interfere with people's safety when it comes to the highway. We don't want live lanes of traffic blocked. We don't want live lanes of traffic slowed down. We don't want accidents caused by this and people's safety affected. So again, be respectful, be polite, protest and get your message out, but do it in the right way and do it safely.
Thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate your insights, and thank you for everybody in your industry for helping to keep everything moving these past 2 years. We really do appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Have a good night.
Earlier this week, Americans observed Martin Luther King Day, which was established in 1986 to recognize the contributions of that indispensable civil rights leader. But did you know that since 2015, Canada has had its own day to celebrate the achievements of one of its great Black historic figures? Every January 21st, we remember Lincoln Alexander, Canada's first Black MP, first Black cabinet minister, and the first Black lieutenant governor anywhere in Canada. And we should particularly do so today because it is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Lincoln Alexander, who died 10 years ago. Let's remember Link, as everyone called him, with someone who knew him very well. Here's Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Ray, who joins us now from Manhattan in New York. Ambassador Ray, I want to take you back to the late 1970s when the two of you were members of parliament at the same time for a couple of years. He was a Tory, you were a New Democrat. Did you get much of a chance at that time to get to know him?
Absolutely. He could not have been more friendly. It's hard to recreate those days, Steve, but when I gave my first speech in the House of Commons, there were a group of conservative MPs, and we were sitting next to them. Front benchers, all of them. Steve Proprosky, who's used to be a great football player, Rayne Harper, who also became the Governor General, and Lincoln Alexander. They were like a kind of a heckling team. It was sort of like a hazing ritual, that I had to go through. And initially, I was quite sort of put off by it, and then I started to relax and have some fun with them. They had some fun with me. And afterwards, and again, this shows, I think, how things have gone awry in our political life. We went out for dinner together, and three really wonderful people. Lincoln knew my dad a bit, and in fact, he'd just been down at the UN and saw my dad there, and he wanted to make sure I knew about that. And we struck up a real friendship. So. It lasted for until he died. I mean, we didn't agree on everything. He was a real conservative. He was a Diefenbaker guy who was very loyal to the chief, but also very open. And as time went on, I found that, I guess it's because I got to know him better, but I can remember being with him when he was LG, and we were at Harvard Collegiate putting a memory capsule under a tree on the occasion of an anniversary at Harvard. It was quite sobering for me because, I mean, Link gave a speech, and after Link's speech, there was no point in anybody else trying to convey a message. He had the students standing up. He had the students, laughing, cheering. Some of them were crying because he was talking about his childhood, and he was talking about growing up as a Black kid in Hamilton, and how he learned how to get along with people, and he also learned how to fight for himself.
Yeah, he did become a cabinet minister in Joe Clark's government in 1979, but only for a very short time because, of course, you helped defeat that government. And I wonder whether you felt any guilt over the years at ending his career in cabinet prematurely.
Well, we used to joke about that too, because he was not happy. I mean, no conservatives were happy with me for a very long time. Some of them still aren't. But Link found himself with more time on his hands, and he was appointed to the Workers' Compensation Board by Mr. Davis. Where he, immediately established a line of communication with me and also with the workers, and then he went on from there to become the lieutenant governor. And so, whenever he would say something about, and he did, in the speech that he gave at my swearing-in ceremony, he made a point of of referring to that fact, how I'd cut his career short. But I said, well, no, actually, I opened it up for you. I mean, you might still be buried in the back benches in Ottawa. You would, you're not going to be a cabinet minister forever. And
do you remember what he said on that day, October 6, 1990? Do you remember exactly what he said? I sure do.
He said, somebody said to him, do you know the premier? He says, do I know the premier? Do I know the premier? Let me tell you about this. He's, we had a lot of interests in common. We were both lovers of jazz. I think Arlene and I have been to a couple of, when things were a little more open than they've been over the last few weeks. We went to Birdland and heard Count Basie's band, and I think Link would have liked that. We shared a love for Ella Fitzgerald. I remember when Ella performed at the Royal York Hotel, and Link and his lovely wife were there, and Link said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "What do you mean? What am I doing here? I love Ella Fitzgerald." He said, "What do you I mean? Really?" And he was kidding me, saying, "Yeah, you can do that? I mean, you get it?" Yeah, I said, "I can do that. I think she's the greatest singer of all time." And there were so many ways in which we got along. When he was LG, I used to meet with him quite a lot. I was, I guess, kind of old-fashioned about that. I used to go and see the LG about once a week or once every 2 weeks. And we would talk, and we would talk about the province. We'd talk about the challenges that I faced, that he faced. We talked about what it's like to, how governing is a lot different than being in opposition, and we both, because he'd been there too. We shared a lot of thoughts about that, and he would give advice. It was always very candid, very direct, and very open. But he loved people. And he was very proud of his own fight. And he was proud, I think as he got older, he got even prouder talking about what his fight was all about, and what his life had been all about, what he was really committed to, what he really cared about. I think when I first met him, I saw him, as more of a partisan conservative, because he was very good in the House. He was quite famously sitting right across from Mr. Trudeau Mr. Trudeau Sr. at a number of moments. And ironically,
what did Mr. Trudeau Sr. tell him to do? Yes,
that's right. Fuddle duddle, as they say. But he and Mr. Trudeau actually had a relationship. Apart from that one episode, they knew each other very well, and they respected each other. I think that I think the LG position helped him to really see the role that he could play in bringing people together, and what he could teach people about his own experiences in the Black community, and his experiences of facing challenges and facing difficulties, facing prejudice, facing discrimination, and at the same time fighting and never giving up the fight.
I do want to pick up on that, if I can, Ambassador Ray, because we have a little clip of him here talking about those days and the issues around fighting discrimination that he faced. So let's play that clip, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
People by the thousands come here every year seeking justice, work, tolerance, and they get all of that, but it's not perfect. There's still some people who still look at people of color with some disdain and dislike, and want to call them names and won't give them jobs, But I think that we're very fortunate to be in Canada, the greatest country in the world, but it's not perfect. But show me a better country when it comes to race relations.
Now, there's the sort of Martin Luther King approach to race relations, which is, lead to demonstrations, huge demonstrations in the streets. But I don't think that was Lincoln Alexander's approach. How would you describe the way he did it?
Well, Link became a lawyer in Hamilton. He opened up a practice. I think practicing law in those days, in the 50s and 60s, was a challenge for him. But I also think it was it really drew out the qualities in him which allowed him to get along with people, to to have friends of every color, of every race, in every part of the world, and frankly, he wanted to get along with people. He really did want to connect with the institutions of the country, and I think he wasn't a preacher; he was a lawyer, and he was also determined to do well in Canada and to make good. I don't think he ever did that at the expense of what he believed or of what he felt and how he needed to share it. And I think it's interesting because one of the things he credits Mr. Diefenbaker with, which I think is important for us to remember, is that Diefenbaker himself felt that he was an outsider. He himself felt that he was coming at the establishment from another place. He wasn't white Anglo-Saxon. He wasn't from the aristocracy or the upper class or anything. He was, Deef was a lawyer on the prairies, and people made fun of him because of his name. And I think he connected with Canadians in an incredible way in 1958 when he won his huge majority. Now, you can all talk about, well, what happened after that and, other qualities and other limitations, whatever. But that part of what the Conservative Party, was all about really appealed to Link. And it's important to remember that Link was elected at a time when it was not easy for Conservatives to get elected in the cities because of Mr. Trudeau's incredible appeal.
He got elected during Trudeau Mania in 1968 as a Conservative in Hamilton.
Exactly right. He was elected as a Conservative in Hamilton, and he had a unique. I mean, he was a terrific politician. He built a coalition in his riding, his constituency. He understood what you have to do to get not only elected but reelected and reelected. You've got to do your constituency work. You've got to build a team in your around you. You've got to bring a lot of people on board who are not necessarily supporters of your party. I mean, that's part of what a really good MP is able to do, is bring those people in. And that's very much what Lincoln did.
Ambassador Ray, we're really grateful you could spare some time for us to remember Lincoln Alexander on his 100th birthday. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I love the guy. I really did. And I think a lot of us in all parties loved him. He was a great guy.
Amen. And now for another perspective on Lincoln Alexander, we are delighted to be joined by his granddaughter, Erika Alexander, who joins us from Stony Creek, Ontario. That's part of Hamilton. Erika, it's great to see you again. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Steve, for having me today.
It's a real pleasure. I'd like to start by asking you, when you were growing up in Hamilton and your grandpa was we know who, did you realize at that time what a big deal he was?
I really didn't as a child. It was kind of the norm for me to live within my grandfather's spectrum of life. But I definitely realized that he was a big deal probably during my time in elementary school, when he would come visit, my grandmother would come visit the school during events or different ceremonies, and I would see the reaction that other kids and their parents would have towards my grandfather. So that kind of made me realize, yeah, he's kind of a big deal. He's somebody important.
That first picture we saw, well, all right, let's do this one here. Who's in this picture here? That's him in the middle, obviously, and who else?
That's my sister Marissa and myself, and this was taken at Leona Station in Hamilton many years ago for a black tie event.
Fantastic. And I wanted to show this one again because, is that you?
That is me. I am just probably within 1 year old there with my grandfather at our home in Stony Creek. And, reading was a big thing for both of us, and it's one of my favorite photos of us.
Indeed. Now, of course, I mean, I knew your grandfather well, but I knew him in a totally different way than you did. We talked a lot of politics when we saw each other. We talked a lot of jazz when we saw each other. But I wonder whether he talked to you about, for example, 1968, when he won his first election and entered the House of Commons, and he's the only black face in that whole House of Commons. Did you talk about that with him?
We did in a way, kind of throughout life. He always was very open about his experience and the journey that it took to get to where he wanted to be. And I think the main thing he always translated was that he just worked really hard and he was very persistent and he stayed confident. And I think that was his main message. As far as him being the first Black member of Parliament, I mean, that was one of his proudest achievements. And that naturally was just passed down to us. And we recognize the power in that and him maybe being an exception at the time, but also opening the gate for many others to come after him.
I always wondered, Erika, whether his example would prompt either, your dad or you to go into public life, and so far, no, eh?
Well, I graduated also from McMaster like my grandfather did, and we both graduated in political science degrees. Earlier in my life, I've focused more on the health spectrum and the holistic world of health. But also, since my grandfather's passed away, I've really taken on the responsibility and representation for our family in regards to his legacy. So that is something that is opening up for me, and I'm currently doing a lot more public speaking and going into that pathway into my life as we speak. So.
Well, in terms of his legacy, I'm not sure he could have got a better shot in the arm than what Ryerson University did for him last year, which was to name the law school after him. How did that come about?
It's something that we were involved with, definitely in communication with Ryerson prior to them announcing the naming of the school. And they approached our family for the blessing to do so. And it's been really a wonderful journey with them. They're an awesome group of people that have been able to pull this off. And I hear really great things about the law school itself. So I know my grandfather would be very exceptionally proud that this place is named after him. I think he would be so honored.
I think you're so right about that because, of course, he and I did talk from time to time about the difficulties of his trying to become a lawyer. This is, of course, many, many decades ago, and how tough it would have been and the discrimination that he would have faced at the time in trying to get through law school and then get that first job, and to imagine that there will be thousands and thousands of lawyers going forward, with a piece of paper saying, I went to the Lincoln Alexander School of Law.
Yeah.
He'd have loved that, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I've told this story before of my grandfather. The reason why he chose to go into law is because when he graduated from McMaster, he had his degree and he went out into the work world to try and find work. And he was discriminated against because of the color of his skin, and he wasn't offered the opportunities that he sought after. And that kind of pushed him to want to go into law so that he could kind of create his own space. And it wasn't easy. And even when he graduated from law, it still kind of was the same experience for him until he met his future law partner, Jack Miller, and they really created a wonderful firm that's still in existence to today.
Mm-hmm. Now, having said all that, Erika, I mean, you think about it, given that he was a man who was born in 1922, he became a member of Parliament, he became a cabinet minister, he became the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. I mean, he did some pretty cool things in his life. So I know he loved Canada as well, right?
He did. He absolutely. I think that was part of his push to accomplish the things that he did. He saw what this country was able to offer him, and even with the discrimination and obstacles to face, he really had his heart in this country. And I think that's what set him apart from a lot of leaders even today, is he solely was concerned about people's ability to have the best life that they could. And I think that was the example that he led in his own life. He just, his heart was always in it.
Mm-hmm. I guess just finally, I want to know, this is the 100th anniversary of his birth. What's your family going to do? I presume something special to mark the occasion?
Yeah, we'll definitely be celebrating this weekend and on Friday. There's a bunch of virtual events. We have the Lincoln Alexander Awards with Queen's Park on Friday, and also Ryerson University is doing their tribute to my grandfather as well. And the Raptors are also doing a tribute on Friday evening for my grandfather. So that's kind of how we're going to celebrate on Friday, and then probably do a little bit something more personal on the weekend just to celebrate his life and remember him and enjoy some memories.
Awesome. Erika Alexander, granddaughter of the great Lincoln Alexander. It's so nice of you to spend some time with us on TVO tonight to remember your grandpa. Thank you so much, Erika.
Thank you, Steve.
Late last year, Bearskin Lake First Nation in northwestern Ontario declared a state of emergency as almost half their community came down with COVID-19. Charnel Anderson covers the northwest for Ontario hubs, and she joins us now from Thunder Bay for an update. Hey, Charnel.
Hey, Dan.
All right, so we'll talk about the current status in Bearskin Lake First Nation, but can you first tell us what happened there at the end of December, beginning of January?
Yeah, so a massive COVID-19 outbreak began in Bearskin Lake late last year, and it quickly overwhelmed the community. It's unclear how the outbreak began in the remote First Nation, which is about 600 kilometers northwest of Thunder Bay, but it was really only a matter of days before Bearskin Lake was in crisis and unable to manage the crisis themselves. So on December 29th, the community declared a state of emergency and went into lockdown, and by January 3rd, 174 people were positive for COVID. So according to a figure by Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, there are 480 people living on reserve in Bearskin Lake. And so 174 people is really a significant chunk of the population that was infected very quickly. And, you know, that included a lot of the First Nations essential workers, so people like council members, frontline workers, you know, the people that really keep the small community functioning. So they needed help and they needed it quick. And people in neighboring First Nations responded swiftly by sending groceries and other supplies to Bearskin Lake. Indigenous Services Canada also responded by sending 4 healthcare workers, so 3 primary care nurses and 1 advanced care paramedic up to the community on December 30th. And they also approved over $1 million in funding for things like PPE, wages for these community-based workers, isolation accommodations, and security efforts, among other things. But with the majority of households isolating in Bearskin Lake, they realized that they needed more help to really ensure that people's basic needs were being met. So on January 3rd, the community issued a press release calling for support from the Canadian military. And in a situation like this, a request for military support has to come from the province. So on January 6th, the Solicitor General made this formal request for military support for Bearskin Lake and a few other First Nation communities. And that request was approved for Bearskin Lake on January 9th. So that same day, 4 Canadian Rangers who are members of Bearskin Lake that were previously isolating were deployed to help with the pandemic response in the community. And in total, the community was promised 7 Canadian Rangers, but last week the community said only 5 of those 7 Rangers had been deployed. It's unclear whether those 2 other Rangers have been deployed since then, but at this point I understand that really the worst of the outbreak is over and the community is in recovery mode now.
Now, when all of that was happening, sort of in the background there, neighboring communities stepped in as well. Some included a 3.5-hour trip to Bearskin Lake First Nation. Can you share some of the initiatives that were happening from neighboring communities to help out?
Yeah. So a lot of people in neighboring First Nations and other communities stepped up to help Bearskin Lake during this crisis. For example, as you mentioned, our viewers may have seen the photo of the Skidoo convoy, which that was on New Year's Day. Dozens of people from Big Trout Lake gathered supplies and it was 3.5 hours, 7 hours round trek on their snowmobiles, really cold weather. So that was pretty remarkable. And, you know, a number of other First Nations also stepped up to help, either by raising money or buying groceries and other supplies and getting them delivered. Another big thing was cutting and delivering wood, because that's what's used to heat homes in Bearskin Lake. And so some of those First Nations, this isn't an exhaustive list, but some of those First Nations include Muskrat Dam, Sandy Lake, Round Lake, Nishnandaga. I spoke to Tanya Cameron, who is a community organizer in Kenora, and as of January 18th, she's raised over $60,000 for Bearskin Lake, which has been used to buy and ship groceries and other supplies like a log splitter, warm work gloves, stuff like that. And there's also another young woman from Kiwewin First Nation named Rayne Harper who wanted to help. So she decided to start a fundraiser, and she raised over $10,000, which was then matched by Kiwewin leadership for a total of over $20,000. So, you know, people in the region were really quick to mobilize, and it was amazing to see. And, you know, the chief and others have expressed their gratitude for all that support.
Indeed. And you mentioned that the situation has improved. Can you give us an update on the situation there?
Yeah, so it does look like things have turned a corner. It looks like cases began declining last week. On January 11th, there were 65 active cases. And about a week later, January 19th, which would have been this past Wednesday, there were 12 active COVID-19 cases, according to a spokesperson for Indigenous Services Canada. And it's my understanding that no one has been hospitalized as a result of this outbreak. And that is probably thanks in part to a high vaccination rate. Over 80% of adults in Bearskin Lake are fully vaccinated. So now the community is really focused on recovery. In a press release issued last week, Chief Kamina Waterman said they're now focused on physical healing and mental health needs of community members.
Now, First Nations and remote communities have faced a lot of challenges over the 2 years of the pandemic. Can you share sort of the specific difficulties that they've had dealing with COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, in short, it's complicated. Especially, emergency response in First Nations, especially remote First Nations, is complicated. For one thing, many First Nations face a lot of systemic issues, which, we can go back to the Indian Act colonization. But, so stuff like the lack of clean water or inadequate overcrowded housing, which can really exacerbate problems, especially, the outbreak of COVID-19. And remoteness also plays a role in this because it takes longer for people and resources to get to remote communities, and it can be quite costly as well. But really early on in this crisis, Bearskin Lake declared a state of emergency. But a First Nation declaring a state of emergency is not the same thing as a municipality declaring a state of emergency. When a municipality declares a state of emergency, it's a legal mechanism that gives the powers that be authority to make decisions. And, they can carry out established emergency response plans, which in turn helps them to rapidly respond to a crisis. And so we saw this early on in the pandemic with cities like Toronto declaring states of emergencies, which allowed the city to implement their own public health restrictions independent of the province. But because of different legislation, First Nations are governed by the Indian Act. These powers aren't extended to communities on reserves. And so a report from Anishinaabe Nation points out that declaring a state of emergency on reserves serves, quote, more of a political function than a legal function, end quote. So it's useful to draw attention to problems and communicate potential remedies, but it doesn't give the First Nation the same authority as a municipality would have in a similar situation. So First Nations are really left to rely on provincial and federal agreements, which can be quite cumbersome, during a time when really urgency is required.
Thank you, Charnel. A very important story, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks, Jan.
The agenda this week looked at how we're taking pictures differently during this pandemic. Also examined the climate risks of a thawing permafrost. Take a look.
So I think we've got a variety of different threats that we are looking at with the permafrost. So as you mentioned, there is the potential for an output of carbon, both in the form of methane and CO2, and that could severely punctuate the warming that we're already seeing in the atmosphere if it were to be released. But then you also have threats from infrastructure destruction, because the ground below the infrastructure in much of Canada and much of the northern hemisphere has the potential to thaw away. And then in a recent paper that we completed, we also looked at nuclear threats, potential microbial threats, and then any other kind of chemical that's been stored in the northern hemisphere permafrost, which is a considerable amount.
John Holdren, what would you characterize the threat as?
Well, as you noted, Steve, some have characterized permafrost as a time bomb. I think it's more like a wildfire that's already doing damage. We know for sure that it's going to grow, and what we are unable to determine exactly is how fast and how much it's going to grow. But the dangers, as Kimberly has already pointed out, are multiple, and many of them are already occurring. The thawing permafrost is causing subsidence of buildings, damage to pipelines and roads, increased coastal erosion, forcing some indigenous villages actually to need to move, and so on. So it's already happening And the real question is, how much bigger will it get and how fast?
And Tony, what would you add to that?
Well, I think the colleagues have already said it very well, but my typical analogy of permafrost thaw and the impacts of climate change causing that thaw is as a freight train. It's actually quite difficult to get permafrost to move in any given direction. There's a lot of heat that you need to get into the ground to change the state of permafrost. But once it gets going, it's very difficult to stop as well. And certainly the amount of carbon in permafrost, as Kimberly mentioned, and the potential for it to be released into the atmosphere is a serious problem, I think, for everybody in the world. And then locally, for Northerners, as John mentioned, we've got the problems of infrastructure, collapse and changes. And then for the rest of Canada or in the US, we have the issue of what the cost might be to maintain that infrastructure during a thawing phase. And that comes back to taxpayers. So we have the local issue, we have the global issue, and we have the kind of the national issues, and all of those apply to the future.
John, just before we get to those questions, I'd like some better understanding of why there is, in fact, so much carbon trapped in the permafrost. How did that happen?
What has happened is over the millennia, we have had cycles of glaciation and then interglacial warmer periods. And what has happened is in the warmer periods, we have a lot of plant growth. Some of that plant growth ends up sequestered in the soil. And before it can all be metabolized by bacteria and released as carbon dioxide or methane to the atmosphere, the subsequent freezing cycle embeds it in permafrost. And this has happened so often that, as I think has already been noted, in some places the permafrost is hundreds of feet thick and contains an immense amount of material that has been frozen and therefore protected from decomposition by bacteria.
Has there been a change in the ways that you capture memories through photography pre-pandemic compared to post-pandemic?
Absolutely. First and foremost, especially since I am a professional photographer, there used to be so many more opportunities to take photos of my family and my friends and my loved ones with my camera. I definitely find that because I'm at home more often and for so long, especially with all of the different lockdowns, I'm taking so many more photos on my phone than I actually was with my professional gear. And on top of that, I, as an individual, I'm definitely taking less because I'm not necessarily getting up and getting dressed and going out and doing all the same things that we were pre-pandemic. So there's a little bit of like less motivation to want to take those photos of yourselves and more of an effort.
Marissa, how about you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, pre-pandemic, I was always taking photos of, you know, myself, my friends, you know, I was studying abroad at the time, so there was a lot that I wanted to capture, a lot that I wanted to remember. And when the pandemic hit, I just didn't have the same drive to capture photos and to capture memories because it wasn't exactly something I wanted to remember. But, you know, as the pandemic continued on, you know, I realized it was going to be much longer than I initially thought. And I noticed that there was the absence of photos in my photo library. And then I said to myself, you know, maybe I should continue to capture photos. Maybe it's important to document this moment, you know, and continue to make memories, even in spite of the pandemic.
Dallas, have things changed for you?
Yes, most certainly. I would say the starkest contrast I noticed on a personal level, because I actually had my second child during the first week of the pandemic. So the way that I documented her arrival at home and her social life in her earliest days was very different. I found I actually had to manufacture experiences and outings, most of which were just going outside to the park, so that she would have memories and feel that I did document her newborn days. Whereas my son, who was born in 2017, you know, he was out socializing and meeting people right away. So we have all those documents. So I find on a personal level, I definitely am like almost manufacturing these experiences and making a conscious effort, as Jenny said, to really force myself to take more photos from my own life. And for my clientele, it certainly changed as well.
So that child of yours, I presume, is coming up to her second birthday very shortly?
That's right, March 24th.
March 24th. And the pictures, I guess, from the first couple of years of her life are completely different from the pictures from the first couple of years of your son's life, I'm guessing. Is that right?
Entirely. My son is in pictures of him being held by family and friends, for example, and doing indoor activities. And my daughter, it's all just us at home or family walks or being in the park at a distance from friends. So I think there's a visual document of the stark differences in the early days, for sure.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's all for this Friday, January 21st, 2022. Monday, how rural municipalities in Ontario are advancing reconciliation. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.